From our free daily newsletter, the latest from If It Works With Your Eyes Closed News.net with Spots Now.
We're holding ourselves back and doing something that I don't think anybody that pursues any commercial interest should ever be doing, which is frustrating our customers.
Oxford Road's Dan Granger, who's been driving the AMP Accords, which published what it calls the first cross-platform measurement standard in history. The document defines a podcast and aims to set implementation standards for attribution and exposure metrics. It argues that these standards are required to grow the industry further and could potentially unlock $1 billion in extra revenue. The document, which has been produced by 12 different companies, will now be taken to standards bodies, including the IAB. The document itself is gated content, and the website requires your email address to read it, which we don't like very much. So in our show notes, you can find a download link that bypasses all of that. Dan Granger speaks in the Pod News Weekly Review this week, interviewed with Giles Martin, who is positive about the play definition in the document and says that the fact that Spotify and YouTube are both already in that ballpark is encouraging for others, that the AMP Accords are already getting some meaningful traction. Well, we think the exposure metrics section of the AMP document asks for podcast apps to share a large amount of data every 30 seconds of content played, including from consenting users a hashed email address and a mobile ad ID. It's another example of podcast app developers being asked to implement features or data collection at their own risk without being given any share in podcasting's success. In an opinion piece today, I argue, for better measurement, give podcast apps a cut of the revenue. Reaction from others. Adopter Media's Glenn Rubenstein has published a blog post in response to the AMP Accords, supporting the Accords as an excellent first step and suggesting it's a workable start, though making a set of suggestions. Rubenstein's an advisor to Podscribe, an AMP task force member. In an email to Pod News, Podtrac's Robert Freeman points to an existing definition of a podcast within the IAB's specification. We've had a definition out in the market for a decade now, since September 2016, he says. Meanwhile, Mark McCreary is not positive, telling us when the sun rises in the west and Apple, Spotify and YouTube decide to share client-side podcast play data with IP addresses, the AMP doc will all be doable. He does add, though, there are nuggets worth the IAB's consideration in its ongoing measurement guidelines discussions. Both are involved in the IAB's spec. Oxford Road's Media Roundtable features Sounds Profitable's Brian Barletta, who describes the definition of a podcast as a defensible, strong way to kick things off. He's described as an advisor to the AMP group. The episode isn't yet published as an audio podcast, so if you wouldn't mind, please watch the YouTube video and close your eyes. And Apple Podcasts wouldn't give us a comment. The company does have a history of listening to feedback, though, and the addition of video is probably a good example of that. We'd hope they harmonise their play count, which is wildly different to the rest of the industry. If you're writing something about the AMP Accords, please tell us, editor@podnews.net. Elsewhere, video-first cross-platform podcast company The Roost has rebranded as Podium. The company publishes this past weekend with Theo Von, among others, and has announced the signing of Just Trish. The company is a long-time supporter of Pod News. The rebranding of this podcast company to Podium has come as a surprise to podcast company Podium, which works with a number of mission-driven and higher education podcasts. Neil McFedrin from Podium told us, "We couldn't help but notice a podcast company launching this week under the name Podium, with a word mark that looks a little familiar too. We've been a proud, long-time supporter of Pod News, so we can't help but wonder where they first came across the brand idea. We're reviewing our options." Podium didn't respond to a request for comment. Independent podcast apps are not growing as a category, says Dustin Bluck, the developer of Castro. He says the growth of podcasting has occurred almost entirely on platforms like YouTube, and independent podcast apps have just stood still. He's concerned that some are interfering with creator content as a way to differentiate themselves, and asks how to move the industry forward. The piece is published at the same time as our editor, suggesting that indie podcast apps should share share in the industry's revenue. Oh, I've emailed Dustin, don't you worry. The Critics' Choice Association has announced the Critics' Choice Creator Awards. There are a set of podcast awards to enter. Submissions open in October and close in February next year. The winners of the Higher Ed PodCon Awards were announced. The International Awards programme is the first to exclusively recognise excellence in higher education podcasting. In the UK, the Audio Academy Festival has announced its first set of speakers. The event is in London on October the 1st. And the June US Podcast Ranker was released by Triton Digital. There's no change in the top 5 sales networks, and Stuff You Should Know is still number 1. The ranker measures participating publishers only and is based on downloads. And in podcast news, the podcast industry is broken, says Laura Mayer, interviewed this week in Podcast Perspectives from the Podglomerate. Apart from Dan Granger and Giles Martin from Oxford Road this week, Pod News Weekly Review also interviews Megan Lazovic from Edison Research at SSRS about the data they've worked on over the past few months. And the new season of You're Dead to Me is out today with an all-new video version. In each episode, host Greg Jenner is joined by a comedian and an expert historian to learn and laugh about the past. And this podcast is sponsored by Spots Now. Try advanced search for podcast advertisers. Spots Now's new AI search ranks all shows on audience fit and targeting, then allows you to see the performance potential in one click, so you can isolate the best shows quickly, and bundles too. From there, you can use the campaign planner, you can exclude competitor conflicts and shows you're running on, and you can even browse last-minute remnant spots matched to you. Try Spots Now search free at spotsnow.io, or click on the link you'll find in our show notes. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe for free, we're at ifitworkswithyoureyesclosed news.net. No, really.